I think most people don't know this, but the U.S. overthrew the Iranian democracy, I believe, in 1953,
Correct.
or 1953, and most people don't know that. That's a very key piece of information that you're missing when you're pointing the finger and throwing Iran in the axis of evil, that we once overthrew them. So I was hoping that you could start off by explaining, why did the United States overthrow the Iranian democracy?
Okay, I think to do that though, I want to actually back up before 53 and start with what the British were doing at the end of the 19th century, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in the 1890s, Britain found itself in a kind of an awkward place, and that was that its oil company, Shell, got purchased by Royal Dutch. And so even though the British had 49% of Royal Dutch Shell, which was good for them for profit-making purposes, it left them out of the position of controlling the interests for that company. And the reason the British became concerned about that was they believed, and obviously rightly so, I mean, they were clearly prescient, they believed that petroleum was going to replace coal, that coal was on its way out, and that the British Empire had to secure a source of oil that they could rely on even if there was a World War style war. And the British at this point hadn't fully dedicated themselves to the idea that they had to put Germany in its place, but were becoming concerned about Germany. And they were building their navy up to counterbalance the fact that the Germans were finally building a navy. And at that point, they decided they had to create a new oil company to replace Shell. So they set off to do this. The way we found oil at the time was you literally just walked along the ground and you hoped you stepped in it. And if you didn't step in it, you hoped you found black shale or black sandstone, because that meant, right, there was oil underneath and it had been absorbed into that porous rock. But the British realized the earth was just too big to do this, to send out armies of people walking, looking for it. So they did something really unusual, and that was they read history books with the specific goal of finding references to oil, especially medieval sources, right? Because if it was ancient, it might be too old, but medieval. And what they realized was that the Arabs were pumping oil through pipes underneath their streets 1,000 years ago into oil lamps, and they lit up their towns. So they knew there must be a large and reasonable oil source, easy to access oil source somewhere in the Middle East. In 1900, the British basically helped a group of tribesmen in the Ottoman Empire stage a rebellion in Kuwait, and then invaded Kuwait to secure it, right, and carved it out of the Ottoman Empire. And that would become their base of operations for their oil exploration endeavors. The very next year, the British set up a deal with the Qajars. The Qajars were the rulers of Persia, because it hadn't yet changed its name to Iran. They were opium addicts, and the deal that the British set up was that they would get a 95% concession, which is, of course, outrageous. You would expect there to be like a 50% concession, since it's Iranian oil, but the British are doing the work of getting it out of the ground. But they got a 95% concession, and one of the reasons was almost certainly because, as the world's first great drug dealer empire, the British Empire had basically a monopoly on opium and just leveraged that against the Qajars. They end up creating the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And lo and behold, 2 years later, in 1903, they find oil in Khuzestan, which is the southwest corner of Iran. And the British are, pumping it out, and they're thrilled because they've got this 95% concession. But then 2 years later, England has some seriously bad luck. In 1905, Persia decides to go democratic. And the British realize that any democratic government is going to vote, they're going to elect to undo that 95% concession. There's no way they're going to leave that in place. And so the British realized that the only way they're going to be able to keep something like that, because it's just too outrageous, is they're going to have to overthrow Iran's democracy. So they begin talking to the Russians. And of course, the Russians are in the middle of the Russo-Japanese War, getting their butts kicked in this humiliating rout. And that's going to actually lead to a precursor to the 1917 revolution in 1906. But in 1905, when the British are talking to the Russians are looking for an easy victory so they can kind of help boost morale. And they conclude that they're going to help the British. They invade Iran from the north, the British invade from the south. And the British, what they do is they pump money into the hands of the clerics, and they get the religious groups in Iran, with the support of the Russian and British armies, to overthrow the democracy. So in 1906, Iran's fledgling democracy is put down. Interestingly enough, that means that Iran gets to get rid of the Qajars. They end up with Reza Shah. He decides to implement a modernization program, but it's pretty clear that if he tries to do anything to the oil concession, he's going to get punked just like the democracy did. And so he leaves that alone. He stays away from that. So then fast forward, and World War II is ended. Iran actually was occupied during World War II by the British and the Russians again. So it gets invaded twice by this Russo-British team. The official excuse is that because the Germans had occupied Norway, it wasn't safe for the Brits to send material to Russia through the Arctic Circle or through the Baltic Sea. So the only way for them to do it safely was to go around Africa and then up through Iran. And so anyway, when the war ends, the British withdraw, and then the Russians hesitate to completely withdraw because their goal was actually briefly to take Azerbaijan. Iran owned about 60% of Azerbaijan, and then Azerbaijan was a socialist republic inside the Soviet Union, and they said they wanted to unify. The United States we threatened to nuke Russia if they didn't withdraw from Iran. That may be the first country we ever threatened to nuke for something. We did it probably a dozen times, if not more. The Russians go, okay, they withdraw. And then in 1950, Iran decides to do a second attempt at democracy. They elect Prime Minister Mossadegh. Mossadegh decides that one of his top priorities is to, in fact, get rid of the 95% concession deal. By this time, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So he decides the first thing he has to do is throw the British embassy staff out, right? Because that's where the spies are. And so he throws the British embassy staff out, and then he goes and he seizes the assets for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and he renames it the National Iranian Oil Company. And he doesn't just get rid of the 95% concession, he gets rid of the Brits entirely. And of course, this sends the British into hysteria. They want to overthrow the government, but they can't because their spy cadre has been thrown out of the country when the embassy was closed. And so in 1950, the British are basically left holding the bag. Again, they have no oil company. It's not technically true because the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had assets elsewhere. But it is essentially true, right? Because they lost their main source of oil at that point. The only thing that they had left really was their Iraq assets, which they had taken in the aftermath of World War I. So the British are scrambling. They actually came to us. They came to the United States, and they asked Harry S. Truman if he would overthrow the Iranian democracy in their name. He had experience doing this. The fledgling CIA in 1949 decided that it would sort of test itself, see what it could do. Miles Copeland was the CIA guy in Syria. He actually staged a CIA-led coup in Syria and overthrew Syria's fledgling democracy. So Truman certainly had the experience. He'd done it before. It wasn't completely alien to him, the idea of doing it. But he says no. He says, no, we're not going to do that for you. In 1952, so just 2 years later, when Eisenhower is running for president, the British come to him and they said, when you win, right, not if, when you win, will you do this for us? And Eisenhower is quick to say yes. And Eisenhower is barely president. He orders the CIA to go ahead and do the coup in Iran. The operative at the time in Iran was a guy named Kermit Roosevelt. And of course, Kermit Roosevelt was Theodore Roosevelt's grandson. Like all good feudal societies, you want to keep things going from generation to generation. So Kermit Roosevelt decides to kind of take a straight approach to it. He goes and he finds members of the Iranian military who are eager to get rid of Mossadegh, that can be manipulated. He convinces them that what they should just do is walk up to his door one night and arrest them, or arrest Mossadegh. So that's exactly what they do. They, it's that 3 a.m. knock late at night, catch the guy in his pajamas. They knock on the door. Mossadegh comes to the door, and the military says, "You're under arrest. We're in the middle of a coup." And Mossadegh goes, "No, you're under arrest." And they're baffled. They're like, "Wait, what do you mean we're under arrest? We're here to arrest you." And out from behind the bushes step Mossadegh loyalists, and they end up arresting the coup leaders. And Kermit Roosevelt was actually watching, but he was off in the distance. And he sees what happens, and he's like running through the streets of Tehran trying to get away. And he does. He gets away, and he goes into hiding. At that point, Eisenhower panics. Eisenhower realizes this could turn ugly, right? This could turn into an international incident. And so Eisenhower calls it off. He says, "Come on, end the operation. We don't need to overthrow Iran." Roosevelt decides that no, he's going to do it anyway, and he goes and he meets with Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the general's dad.
Norman
Schwarzkopf Sr. was, yeah, exactly. Norman. Sr. was in fact a businessman who had dealings throughout the Middle East, and could probably be described as a lover of the Middle East. He certainly understood the culture. He knew a lot of the background. Interestingly enough, you could probably describe Roosevelt that way. So it's kind of interesting. Like, here's this guy who clearly has a lot of love for the Middle East, but at the end of the day, his nationalistic attitude trumps any loyalty he had there. So Roosevelt goes to Schwarzkopf Sr. and says, "Help! What should I do?" And they come up with a brilliant plan. What Roosevelt's going to do is he's basically going to take bags of CIA money. He's going to go to the corner of the streets where all the day workers are and hire them. And then he's going to have them hold up signs saying, "We support Mossadegh. We support the government. We want more democracy." And then have them march up and down the streets and then end their protest by attacking businesses and breaking things and attacking property. And so this starts to happen. And everyone's baffled. Like, Mossadegh's like, we're in charge. I'm the prime minister. You don't need to do this. Things are going well. Stop. And they keep doing it. And he keeps telling people, "Stop. Don't protest like this. We don't need to protest like this." And eventually what happens is it turns the public opinion and the army's opinion against Mossadegh. And eventually the military steps in and they put him under house arrest and overthrow his government. And so in a nutshell, we do what really, when you think about it, is a precursor to Chechenization. It's this, we flip the thing upside down. We make it look like it's that the supporters of the guy we want out of power are these thugs running around smashing things, when in reality that was just us. And the guys that we were against were actually not necessarily acting badly.
No, that was just the CIA.
That was just CIA.
Just the CIA doing that.
Yeah.
What I find funny is that Truman said no at first, where he's like, no, the U.S. doesn't do that sort of thing, overthrow democracy.
Exactly. That's his attitude. Like, even though he had just done it the year before in Syria.
Yeah, he had just been literally doing it. And then why do you think Eisenhower was so willing to help out the British?
So that's the question of questions. So the myth about Eisenhower, the thing that we're always sort of propagating and talking about, is that when he was Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, because technically he was in charge of even the British forces, he grew to love the Brits, and there was this symbiotic relationship established, and he was just loyal to the Brits. And I think the reason a lot of us believe that was because he pushed that narrative. But in reality, I think there was actually something way more interesting going on. If you look at his policies, like the things that he systematically does for his 8 years as president, he regularly undermined the British and the French, to the point where he gave them humiliating defeats. Like in 1956, when the British, the French, and the Israelis attack Egypt, he sides with Egypt against the British, the French, and the Israelis. And he actually manages to get the Security Council, I don't know how still, I need to figure this out, but he manages to convince the UN to send in soldiers to Egypt that will actually end up fighting the British and the French if they don't pull out. And, they pull out, so they don't have that fight. But just the fact that happens turns the 1956 Suez Canal War into this epic rout for the British and French politically. And that's the Eisenhower's style. He supports the communists in Iraq in '58. He's supporting the Algerian revolutionaries against the French in the '50s. He's regularly on the other side of the British and the French. So I think his real motive in Iran was to pretend like he was helping Britain, do the coup, and then muscle the United States into Iran's oil fields. The British actually ultimately, they're not thrown out of Iran. Like, they do get to come back. They were thrown out by Iran, but they do get to come back after the coup, but not the same way. They're going to be a minor partner. Iran becomes effectively a U.S. colony as opposed to a British colony. It was never a colony, but the sphere of influence flipped from British to U.S. And so what I really think he did was he saw an opportunity to get Exxon in there. I think he saw an opportunity to get U.S. oil companies in there, so he could pretend like he was helping the British, but screw them at the same time. And that's what we want too.
Yeah, and the Eisenhower doctrine was to get the British and the French out of the Middle East.
Yeah, I think it was even broader than that. The Eisenhower doctrine, I think, was really literally to destroy the British and French empires and then replace them with the U.S. empire. And I think his goal, that was his priority. And then after that was to keep the Middle East divided against itself, and then maybe then fight communism, which was, in contrast to Truman, because his goal was, we have to fight communism by all means available to us.
So after they overthrow Mossadegh, how did they implement the Shah right away, or is there like a grace period? Like how did that work?
Okay, so what happened actually is the British are the guys who put the Shah in power when they invaded in World War II. What happened was the Brits go to the Shah and they go, we want you in charge. And, the Shah is baffled. He's like, well, my dad is in charge. And they go, yeah, we'll put your dad under house arrest and put you in charge. And the Shah was such a duplicitous bastard that he actually punks his own dad and works with the British and the Russians. So the British see him as a guy they can work with. And then in 1953, when we punk Mossadegh, basically we then prop the Shah in his place. And we realize we can work with him. You know, the British liked him, but we realized that he was our man. And he will tyrannize Iran for a quarter century afterwards. You know, he has these grandiose visions for modernization, for the Iranian culture, the Iranian nation. But at the end of the day, he's really just a two-bit tyrant. He does modernize Iran a little bit. He does these really kind of grotesque things where he tries to bring back ancient Iranian culture. He sort of pushes back against contemporary Iranian culture, and you know, spends exorbitant amounts of money on these celebrations of Iran's ancient past. And there were poor Iranians wondering, what are you doing spending money on something that happened 25 centuries ago? But then also you couldn't oppose him politically. He was going to put you in prison if you did.